Danny Flexen here for Seconds Out. Delighted to be joined by my good friend, renowned boxing journalist. I think it's fair to say. Hope that doesn't embarrass you in any way. Gabriel Montoya. Gabe, how are you?
I'm doing well. Nice to be renowned. I'll take it.
Yeah. You've always been renowned. I've just said it for the first time today.
Oh, I'll
Um,
take it.
um, Before we get into the whole kind of Eubank Jr., Conor Benn situation, you've become an eminent authority on PED usage and the punitive relationship with that in boxing specifically. Just tell us a bit about the work you've done in this area previously.
I've written about 75 pieces in a pretty short period of time. I think starting back in like 2010 when Floyd Mayweather first asked Manny Pacquiao to do, third-party drug testing with
Mm.
USADA, the United States Anti-Doping Agency. From there, I wrote about 75 pieces, broke a bunch of stories about drug users, both some, alleged dealers like Memo Heredia, and a little bit of history about Alex Ariza, to just straight up users. Like I broke the story when VADA, the Voluntary Anti-Doping Agency, first came on the scene in 2011, 2012, and they caught the first two people out the gate that they tested, Lamont Peterson and Andre Berto. I broke both those stories. But I think that, probably the most important story I wrote right out the gate was about Nevada. And this is a thing that still exists. It was called New York, Nevada, and the TE ratio loophole in boxing. And the TE ratio is, testosterone to epitestosterone. Everybody is basically 1 to 1. But in New York and Nevada, the threshold is 6 to 1. You can have 6 times the amount of testosterone. And that stirred the hornet's nest right off the bat. That got the former athletic director Keith Kaiser to call me and tell me it was a hit piece and to get really upset. And that's when I knew I really had something. And to this day, that TE ratio loophole still exists.
Keith Kaiser, I do remember him very well actually.
Yeah.
Nice guy, but yeah, quick to hold a grudge as well, perhaps.
I'll call him
Um,
a polite guy. I don't know if he was necessarily nice from my end.
I'll bow to your superior knowledge of the man, to be honest. Um, So before we go specifically about Ben, just explain to the viewers, if you don't mind, exactly what VADA's role is and how it differs in some respects from a US ARDA or a WADA.
VADA is started by Dr. Margaret Goodman and Dr. Flip Homansky. They were both the chief ringside physicians, chief medical officers in Nevada, which is kind of the flagship of boxing, particularly in the United States. They designed a program that would be a third-party anti-doping agency that would be specifically tailored to combat sports, taking their wealth of knowledge and trying to apply it. At this, at the start, they used a test called it's called CIR, carbon isotope ratio testing, which tests for synthetic testosterone. They use that as their screening test. That test is available to USADA and all the other testing agencies, but they don't use it up front, which is kind of ridiculous. They also test for EPO, which is a blood doping drug. It's Lance Armstrong's favorite drug
Hmm.
in his program, which increases red blood cell count. If you think about that for a boxer, a guy that has increased red blood cells, he never gets tired. Similar to, let's say Shane Mosley used EPO in the De La Hoya rematch, and he was able to come back in the second half of the fight and win that fight. Energy is the most important thing in boxing, so cheating that way is pretty dangerous. When one guy's tired, the other guy isn't, a death can occur or serious injury. So they put those two things up front. Now, they're not a WADA, World Anti-Doping Agency signatory, VADA, precisely because they don't follow the same protocols. They use those tests up front. They've never tested for THC. They believe that's not a performance enhancer that needs to be tested for. And so they're not part of the World Anti-Doping Agency. And that leaves a gray area for the people in boxing to say, well, they're not WADA signatories, or we only follow WADA, which is something that you didn't really hear until VADA came on the scene, that loophole, because in Nevada, and this is from Keith Kaiser, they follow WADA sometimes, like when it works for them, because WADA used to have that 6 to 1 TE ratio. They lowered it to 4 to 1, but Nevada strangely kept theirs at 6 to 1. So what VADA is at this point, they're only used by one sanctioning body, the WBC. The WBC created the Clean Boxing Program, which is a program for the top 15 fighters that they rank. They have to, in order to be a part of WBC ranking, they have to join VADA, and they have to be eligible to be tested year round.
Mm.
Now, that doesn't mean they're actually tested year round. They're kind of like UCAD. You sign up, maybe you get tested, maybe you don't. They're trying to use that old school deterrent factor that maybe, you know, you don't know when they're coming, so don't use any drugs. And after a while, you're in that program, you realize nobody's ever coming. VADA, they do show up like once a year, but still, that's not much of a deterrent. You know, once you get your test and you've been in for a while, you go, well, I'm clear for the rest of the year. So that's the gray area that we're looking at in this Benn Eubank situation, is that people sign up for VADA. Both camps agreed to do it. The promoters agreed to pay for it. But when push comes to shove and somebody in your camp tests positive, suddenly you're like, hey, UCAD doesn't recognize these guys, so we don't really need to listen to them. Because the thing with VADA is they're a testing agency. They don't adjudicate the punishment. They let the fighters know when somebody tests positive, they let the promoters know, and they let the relevant commission or governing bodies know, as well as a sanctioning body, I believe. But they have no ability to punish anybody. So it's up to the honor system at that point for people to do something. And as we're seeing with Eddie Hearn and that great video that was going around yesterday from D-Style Boxing, where it's Eddie Hearn versus Eddie Hearn, it depends on, you know, if the other guy tested positive or his guy tested positive for him to really care about doping.
Yeah, it's interesting. I saw one of the questions you were asked on social media. I think it was earlier today. It might have been yesterday. Why would there be a case where a finding would come up in VADA's testing, so in this case clomiphene, and not in the UK ADA test that, from what we're told by Eddie Hearn, Ben has passed with flying colours?
Because VADA's testing program, like in WADA, there's a major difference. You know, WADA doesn't do the testing, but they set a standard that everyone else follows, right? But there's a lot of like stimulants, for example, that you can take out of competition, and you're fine with WADA, you know, guidelines. VADA tests for everything all the time. They don't let people do stimulants out of competition. So we don't know if UCAD actually tested for clomiphene. We just know that they tested. So they might not have tested for the same thing. But also, you know, what I would like to see is a reporter find out the dates that UCAD came, how many times they did, and compare that to the amount of times and dates that VADA came. Did they come on the same day? Because what you're looking at when you catch somebody positive is a cycle. You get a peek into their program. And with Clomid or clomiphene, there's a couple ways to use it. You could use it by itself, and what it is an estrogen blocker. It makes it so that your body doesn't detect the amount it shuts off the receptors, and your body doesn't know how much estrogen is in its system. So it starts kicking out more. And so then the rest of your system goes, oh, there's too much estrogen. Let me start kicking out testosterone and other hormones. And so you've tricked out your system. The other way to use it is at the end of a cycle when you've been doing you know, anabolic steroids, or you've been doing just straight up testosterone. You have too much. And so you're kind of, your body's been kicking out too much estrogen, so now you're using an estrogen blocker to balance you out. So the positive just is showing that there was a cycle going on of some kind, or a program going on. We don't know exactly what it was that was happening. So that's probably why, you know, maybe UCAD came in at a different point in the cycle, or the drug had cleared his system, and so he was fine. And then VADA came in right after or before, and was able to catch it. Just because, you know, even though there was negative VADA tests before and after, you know, all that we really should be dealing with is the positive. To me, all that other stuff is politics.
And I mean, it was very similar in the Dillian White situation, that there was a negative test before and after, but people who really cared about the subject focused on the positive, which is what we should be doing.
And if you follow drugs long enough, you'll see these narratives come along. Well, I don't know how it got in my system, or I was negative on either side. These are all just things that a lawyer is telling them to say.
Well, on that note, the B sample. Now, this is something that we've heard a lot in previous cases, and again here. How often, roughly, I don't expect exact stats, but how often does the B sample result differ from the A sample?
Like never? like, if there's a case, I mean, somebody can correct me, but I think as we found out now, guys know, the B sample and the A sample are coming from the same
Mm.
urine sample. They just get split into two. That way, there's a backup in case something goes wrong, or if it tests positive and the guy wants to test it, and off the offhand chance that the lab screwed up. Um, More often than not, it doesn't get tested, and they go some other route. Um, but it's up to the person who tested positive whether or not to pull that trigger and say, let's test the B sample. That's generally why people wait. They want to try all their other things, all their other avenues, and then they'll pull the trigger on the B sample if they really need to. What
Because
I'd
the
like to
only
see, oh, no, go ahead.
I was going to say, because the only way, in theory, that the B sample would differ from the A is through laboratory contamination. But VADA is the gold standard, so it's very unlikely that that's going to happen.
Well, and they're all using, for the most part, they're using the same, WADA accredited
Mm.
labs. So, like USADA and VADA might be using, the Salt Lake City lab, or I'm not sure when it's in the UK, I'm not sure which lab they use, but, the Olympics and these top level athletes all over the world are being tested. And so, they're going to go to appropriate labs. It's not like they're going to, Quest Labs at, your local neighborhood, uh, non-WADA accredited lab. These are high-level tests that need high-level scientists and certain lab standards to be done.
Now, as we talk right now, there is supposed to be a press conference underway.
Mm.
I'm not too screening, so I don't know, but presumably it's still going ahead, even if it's just to announce that the show's off. We're not sure what the status is. Eddie Hearn said earlier he won't go ahead with a different governing body, and the British Boxing Board of Control have said already that they prohibit the fight. They can't sanction it. If the fight were to go ahead, just give us an idea, and we're not casting any aspersions, but just generally, what impact could this increased testosterone have on a combat athlete in a performance setting?
Increased strength, perhaps stamina, but I think it's strength and power, explosiveness is a thing. Like back in the day when I was a beat reporter for Max Boxing and Seconds Out, I lived here in LA. Well, I do here now again, but I used to spar pretty regularly and train pretty regularly, and I did also in San Francisco. The reason I bring this up is not to humble brag, but uh, a couple times I got in there with a dude that was on testosterone. One guy told me, and the other guy, I was grappling, and he stood up, and his shirt came up, and he had a patch, and I was like, "What's that?" And it's like, "Oh, it's a testosterone patch." And that dude was ragdolling me, like just unnatural strength. I'm not the best grappler in the world, so it wasn't that big of a feat. But the boxer, I know how to move around a bit. When we would come up for like a clinch, it was like hitting a brick wall. Like it was unnaturally strong. And he was like, now you know what it feels like. And to me, that was the biggest difference. With other people, it's like, yeah, people are strong, but they're kind of malleable. You can move. With a dude on testosterone, it was like hitting a brick wall. It was just unnatural strength. So that's just my personal experience. But talking to guys like Victor Conte, who would know, as a former drug dealer or PED dealer, one of the very best. He would say the same thing. It's strength, it's speed, it's power, explosiveness, and it's the ability to keep training in the gym too, to kind of build up all those attributes.
And why do we feel that the Boxing Board of Control haven't suspended Conor Benn? Because this is something that Eddie Hearn's brought up a number of times now, that you haven't suspended him, which means he's clear to fight, but you're not letting the show go ahead. And I see that there may be an attempt there to muddy the waters, but why do they not have enough, if you like, to suspend him at this point?
Eddie Hearn muddy the waters. I'm shocked. He's I think it's because it's legal. If UCAT doesn't recognize VADA as their testing agency and they did their own tests and Conor Benn passed their tests, they don't have any legal recourse to suspend him. It's kind of a weird gray area. I feel like, we know that VADA works. They catch people all the time. And fights have gone on when VADA caught somebody, but the local commission didn't recognize them. The Oscar Valdez fight is that example. I think it was USADA that caught Eric Morales in the rematch with Danny Garcia and let that fight go on. That was the first precedent. Um, I think at this point we know that they work. I really think things need to change, and that people need to acknowledge who Margaret Goodman is to the sport. She's now an International Boxing Hall of Famer for her work as a medical professional in the sport. VADA's caught quite a number of people, way more than USADA ever did. Um, and I just think it's time that the commissions need to get on board here before a death happens. Or, we're probably already seeing serious injury from people being hit by people on PEDs. If VOD is catching this few people with their budget, or this amount of people with that kind of small budget, imagine if like Elon Musk said, "Hey, let me throw $1 billion at you guys and have a good drug testing program and test everybody all the time, all year round," which is what I think needs to happen. I don't think we need to extend, the suspension times. If we're looking at like, step out and look at like the U.S. drug war, right, and how putting people in prison, it's just gotten more and more and more. 20 years, 30 years, and yet drugs are readily available, more so than ever. They're cheaper, easier to get. So obviously, it's suspending people doesn't really work. But if you tested people more often year round, that deterrent factor would actually become a real factor. You'd catch people more often, and maybe then things would level out. But I would add two other factors. Like Jean Pascal tested positive for EPO twice. For him to get his license back, he would need to join VADA in my world, year round, never stop. He would also need to tell us where he got those drugs and from whom. That way we could get that person out. I always go back to a quote from Freddie Roach. He told me years ago on Leave It in the Ring radio. And this is years after Ariza had left his gym. And he said, "You want to get rid of drugs in boxing, get rid of the strength and conditioning coaches, because those are the guys that brought it in." And so, I'm not going to do a broad brush on every one of them,
Sure.
but when you test positive, you got the drug from somewhere. We need to know from where if you ever want to box again. I don't think that's an unfair or unreasonable thing to ask. And I think that would go a long way to clean up the sport.
I agree. Just finally, apparently the board were aware of these adverse findings back in September the 23rd, which is what, 2 weeks ago, or just under 2 weeks ago now. And they've decided it's not in the best interest of boxing for the fight to go ahead under their jurisdiction yesterday. Why has it taken so long? And because with the Dillian White case, he was asked to come before a hastily convened hearing on the day of the fight with Oscar Rivas. They let the fight go ahead, and then the news broke afterwards and caused plenty of controversy, as you would imagine. This time, the public are aware of what's going on because of Riyadh Al Samurai, the Daily Mail, who broke the story. Um, and now the board have decided it's not in the best interest. Is that purely because the public at large know about it this time around?
Yes, absolutely. When I broke the Peterson and Berto cases, I waited. I want to say I knew for well over a week. I'd have to look at my notes again. Maybe it was 2 weeks for both of those, which is a very long 2 weeks when you have a story that no one else has. but but it felt like, and immediately my relationship with Golden Boy, everyone there changed as soon as I broke those stories, and it was my opinion that they were waiting. They wouldn't have said anything if I hadn't broken the story in both of those cases, and I feel that that's the same thing here. Is that they waited and hoped that it would blow over, or the camps would figure it out, and we would get to this 11th hour, and that we would just have to do the fight because it was, too much at stake. Um, what I think what Ben needs to do here, this is another thing I think that needs to become standard. When Canelo tested positive, he did a hair follicle test, which is a test that shows long-term drug use if it's there. Now, there's some questions about the science that if your hair is lighter, it's harder to detect it. But in this case, Conor Benn has dark hair, and it is a very much detectable long-term drug use. I think that needs to become standard. That way that we can eliminate somebody put it in my drink, or I accidentally did it. If you can't prove where you got this contamination from, the way Canelo did with receipts of this is where the meat came from, and he had a whole thing, you got to do the hair tests, and you got to do at least a year of VADA testing in order to get back in the good graces. As Canelo shows us, you'll never wash the stink of tainted meat off of you, but you can at least do these things to kind of show, hey, I'm trying at least to show that I'm clean. I think that needs to become standard. Um, just no question here, but we'll see.
And as we've been talking just now, the fight between Chris Eubank Jr. and Conor Benn has officially been postponed.
Good.
The promoters in their statement still criticise the British Boxing Board of Control quite significantly and suggest that there will be a legal dispute ongoing, but have decided it's in the best interest of everyone involved to postpone the contest, presumably the whole show, at this time. I mean, it's a shame, I guess, for all the undercard fighters who have done nothing wrong, and Chris Eubank Jr., of course, who's under no suspicion at all of doing anything wrong either. But the right decision overall.
I think so. That's another change I think that needs to happen that would help clean up the sport. Make the guy that tested positive liable, or the promoters. There needs to be some sort of insurance for the undercard fighters because no one gets paid unless they fight, which is pretty messed up. You know, that's like 15 fighters that are all out of money, and you know, they did their training expenses, and the promoters don't get you know, their money. There needs to be some sort of insurance policy so that this doesn't happen. But I think if you add in all the things, testing more, doing confirmation tests like the hair follicle test afterwards, a year of VADA testing, make the penalty not just losing, you know, make it this kind of stringent obstacle course you have to go through once you test positive, and then make yourself financially liable, not just losing your payday, but having to pay money out. And guys will think twice before doing a shortcut, I think. And I got to give props to, I think it was Gareth Davies that broke the story initially.
I think it was Riyadh Al Samurai at the Daily Mail initially.
Oh, my bad. I'm sorry. Well, thank you for correcting me. But it proves that journalism works, and I think we need that component. I see some, you know, kind of cynical pundits like, I don't care about drug testing. And, you know, if you care about boxing, you've got to care about the fighters. And I just think that good journalism, people staying on the drug stories, always asking in the press conference, is this VADA tested? When does it begin? Finding out those details should become part and parcel of the job. That way it's not a mystery, and the press isn't reactive, that they don't have to play catch up when somebody tests positive, that we already know everything kind of going in. Who are the strength and conditioning coaches? What are their histories? I think all that stuff is, you know, Steve Kim, my old writing partner, used to say, this isn't Washington, D.C., you know, it's not politics, but to me, it is. It's people's lives. It's their livelihood. So props to the journalists that caught this. And I just want to encourage more journalists to be upfront. People, you can be friendly. These people aren't your friends. And so you got to ask the tough questions.
Great stuff. Really, really appreciate your insight, Gabe. It's been an education for me, as I'm sure it will be for a lot of people watching. So thank you.
I really appreciate you reaching out, Danny. Thanks so much. Anytime, man.
All right, let's do it again soon. It's good to speak to you.
All right, man. Peace.
Take care.